rolling and anytime.
My name is Joe Gary, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Broadway Buzz. I'm very sorry I'm not with you tonight, but actually I'm in Santiago, Chile. I've put together a theater piece on the great poet Pablo Neruda, and we're presenting this musical entertainment actually in his home in Santiago. So I will be missing several days of Broadway Buzz. Please forgive me. I so look forward to coming back as soon as I can. But I can guarantee you this, you're in for a very special treat. Frost Nixon is a monumental theater piece. It's performed by two towering artists, and it's a production I think you'll be thinking about and talking about for a long time to come. Of course, I'd like to start with a kind of Nixonism, if I might. A man is not defeated when he's finished. He's defeated when he quits. This was a letter that Richard Nixon wrote to Ted Kennedy after Chappaquiddick, but of course it might have been the anthem of the rest of Richard Nixon's life. Even though he was defeated, he never quit. What we're seeing tonight is a brilliant playoff of two very powerful forces. David Frost, the interviewer, and President Nixon defending his life and his career. It's so ironic in many ways to me. You know, we deal with art and we deal with life. The life experience, of course, was really seeing the debate that happened. They were 4 90-minute segments that played literally all over the world. It was the most watched television of its day, and it set the standard for TV journalism from that point in 1977 to the present. But ironically, the play you're seeing tonight, Frost Nixon, really treats the two men in a much fairer and much more objective way than really the interviews did. So you're in for a very special treat, in the same way that Shakespeare would take historic events and treat them as a storyteller and turn history into drama. In the same way, the playwright you're seeing tonight has done the same thing and with the same level of distinction. Let me just go back and sort of summarize for you with Richard Nixon. Your program outlines for you a very brief sort of précis of Nixon's life. Clearly, through his presidency, he was obsessed with the issue of the Vietnam War. And beyond that, he made a negotiation with the Soviet Union that would set the way for a peace negotiation that would literally transform the world and ultimately end the Cold War. And beyond that, he opened the doors to China. So in many ways, he deserved the prestige that he had. At one point in his presidency, he was as popular as John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And then, of course, Watergate happened. And then, of course, one of the greatest falls from grace occurred in the 20th century. Richard Nixon, of course, is responsible for all that happened. Watergate was of his doing. He maneuvered it in a very clumsy and awkward way, and it ultimately led to his downfall. One more Nixonism for you before we go on. He said, television reporting is to journalism as bumper stickers are to philosophy. Now, keep in mind, all of his career, he fought with the media. And the fight ultimately would lead to his downfall. It was, of course, two young men working for the Washington Post who started to expose the issues of Watergate, and it ultimately led to the fall of a titan, and it was the end of Nixon's presidency. For a moment before we go on, I would like to remind you about a story you might not know about the two writers Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, who broke that Watergate story. They were both working for the Washington Post. They were being paid less money than any other member of the Washington Post. They were really neophytes, and yet they came up with the story of the century, and they helped to redefine investigative journalism. After they were writing all these reports, and as Watergate was really cooking and in the national news, Robert Redford, the great actor-director, contacted them and said, "I hope when all of this is over, you plan on writing a book." And the both men said, "Yes, of course, we will reissue all of the reports we have written." And he said, "No, you've already given us those reports. We want to hear the story behind the story." And of course, what was created was All the President's Men, which turned out to be, one of the best-selling books of the decade. But beyond that, it became a major film that really exposed politics. It was a very prismatic film that worked on a variety of levels. It caught the time, the place, the action, the politics, and it made us see the story behind the story. That's what you're going to see tonight with Frost-Nixon. Many of us sat through those 4 90-minute segments of the event on television. But what's fascinating is to see what went on behind the scenes. And that's what we're going to focus on now, the making of this brilliant play. Now, first of all, let me just go back and talk a moment about David Frost. Your program indicates, of course, a lot of information about David Frost. I want to remind you of a couple of things. We all remember him as being a sort of talk show host extraordinaire. But remember, his first great debut in American television came in 1962-63 when he presented This Is the Week That Was. It was a political commentary, a satire on the news of the week. And again, this would lay the groundwork for Saturday Night Live, and it would lay the groundwork for Second City and all of the other satiric reviews that would follow in this format of focusing on political issues. So David Frost made a very big splash in America in a very important way during a very tempestuous time. Beyond that, he went on and had a major television show that was broadcast from New York. He subsequently moved on and literally presented shows in London, in Australia, and literally everywhere in the world. But by the time we come to our story, the story of Frost-Nixon interview, remember both of the major contestants are really very down on their luck. Of course, Nixon has resigned from office. He's had so many financial obligations with legal fees, etc., that he's in desperate need of money. No one will really even hire him as a speaker. And David Frost's illustrious career was now sort of fading. So both men had very high stakes in doing this interview. I mean, Nixon, to redeem himself and to finally have a chance in an extended period of time, aside from news clips, to really state what his position was on Watergate. On the other hand, David Frost pulled a major coup. Everyone in the business, especially Mike Wallace, wanted to interview the president, and he won away this option. It's interesting for a moment to look at the real-life facts of what happened. David Frost had this brilliant idea of doing a very extended commentary on interviewing the president. And he went to Swifty Lazar, who was the foremost entertainment editor in the world, and he said, we really need to make a deal with President Nixon. Everyone was courting President Nixon at this point. CBS, NBC, Mike Wallace, everyone was on him, but no one was really willing to pay for a political interview. But David Frost said, yes, he would certainly pay for this option. So in the final analysis, it cost $600,000. It set a whole new level of standard to pay a political figure to be interviewed about his political career. But David Frost then went on to maneuver the best part of the deal. He said that Nixon would have no editorial input into the process. They would agree on the rules of the interview, but that all of the editing, all of the final shaping of the piece would totally be in the hands of David Frost. So this was a sort of monumental decision. The play is about the whole process of how David Frost raised the money, how he was able to talk Nixon into doing it. You get all of the backstage views of this in this brilliant production of the play. I now would like to introduce the playwright to you. The playwright, to begin with, had a very long career in films. Peter Morgan gave us some of the great films of the last 5 years. He wrote the screenplay for The Queen, and I would like to take a moment to talk about that because the parallels in the screenplay for The Queen and the parallels with Frost-Nixon are very strong, and if you understand one, it's very insightful and a way for you then to look deeply into Frost-Nixon. In the case of The Queen, the story obviously was about Princess Diana's death. We all followed that with so much interest. And we all have sort of photographic memories of where we were, what happened, when the event happened, how we learned about it, how we followed it with the greatest of interest. But the story of the Queen is really about what happened in Buckingham Palace, what happened behind the scenes with Queen Elizabeth. So keep in mind, when the screenwriter wrote this, he didn't have real access to the Queen. She obviously was not giving personal interviews about what her innermost thoughts were during this period. But in any case, he was able to construct a very believable and brilliant story that even the Queen had to say she deeply admired. And again, in many ways, that movie did more to redeem the reputation of the Queen than all of the money that the royal court spent in trying to build her image internationally. So the playwright is a man of great substance. I want you to think of him as a kind of modern-day Shakespeare, because he does exactly the same thing Shakespeare did. He would take literal historic events, he would borrow from history very freely, he would quote from history very freely, as the play quotes from the debate, but then he will tell the story as he sees it. So just as Shakespeare told Macbeth's story, just as Shakespeare told Lear's story, even though these stories are based on history, he interpreted them and gave them a dramatic life and turned them into a brilliant play. And this is the same thing that the playwright has done in the case of Frost-Nixon. So obviously he did that with the Queen. I always loved one of the reviews from the Queen that said, "Isn't it interesting, if they can make Helen Mirren look so much like the Queen, why can't they make the Queen look like Helen Mirren?" And of course, that's a good question. But the same sort of parallel exists in Frost-Nixon and the Queen. Keep in mind, Helen Mirren had to do an impersonation of one of the most famous women in the world. Queen Elizabeth has been photographed, and her photograph has been disseminated literally to every corner of the world. So when she played the Queen, she had to find the stance, the attitude, the composure, the mannerisms to play it. But beyond that, she had to interpret the role. And that's the same thing that you're going to see tonight. Both actors playing Frost and Nixon give towering performances. They don't simply give impersonations, they give interpretations. And that's really what's important, to find the essence of the character and to play it. Okay, so we have a playwright then who started his career in films. He did another brilliant film called The Last King of Scotland. And of course, in that film, also, he does the same thing. He takes history, he takes an outrageous leader of an African country, he takes a young Scottish man who works as his assistant, he deals with a story about genocide, all kinds of political horrors, etc. And the end result is he creates a brilliant and insightful movie for our time. There's a new work that the writer has just done in England called The Deal. And The Deal is a story about Tony Blair turning over his power to Gordon Brown. And of course, the English adored this piece and followed it with the greatest interest. And the end result is you see then this very strong pattern in the work of this writer, taking history and turning it into drama. Most recently, he's created a movie called The Other Boleyn Girl, which is about Anne Boleyn's sister and about the intrigues in the court of Henry VIII. So again, he becomes a sort of master historian historian, master philosopher, but then brilliant storyteller. Okay, so let us go then very specifically to how this play happened. The screenwriter had a long career of very successful Academy Award-winning films, The Last King of Scotland, The Queen, etc. But he had never really written a play. So he went to the Donmar Warehouse, and the Donmar Warehouse is a very intimate theater, like our off-Broadway theater. It would be most like the Public Theater in New York. And the Donmar Warehouse has a 250-seat horseshoe-shaped seating, so the audience sits on 3 sides, and the show then is a very intimate treatment of whatever the storyline may be. Sam Mendes, the great director, who's married to Kate Winslet, who has a major film out right now, worked in that space and really developed the Donmar Warehouse and turned it into a first-class operation. He was then succeeded by Michael Grandage, and Michael Grandage is the director of the show you're seeing tonight. He is also the artistic director of the Donmar Warehouse. Well, the playwright went to the Donmar and said, I have an idea for a play. Even though I don't have a history as a playwright, I certainly have a respectable history as a screenwriter. And so the Donmar Warehouse said, we're very anxious in proceeding with this project. And he knew what he wanted to do was to dramatize the Frost-Nixon interviews. So the first thing the playwright had to do was to go and meet with David Frost to get permission to use the quotes from the debates. They are still owned by David Frost. So the end result is, when he went to David Frost, he said, I'm asking for several things. One, I'm asking not to pay you. There will be no royalty. I'm not buying these rights. We're presenting it in this tiny 250-seat theater. But if it moves to the West End, which is a major theater in London, you will then share in the profits. If it then moves to New York, you will, of course, share in the profits. And if it's turned into a film, you, of course, will share in the profits. So David Frost agreed to this. But the next issue was a very difficult issue. The playwright said, you will have, David Frost, no editorial control over this material. You are giving me your life, your primary work, the interviews, and you are letting me do with it as I see fit. Now, David Frost said, well, this is going to be a deal breaker. I don't think I can do this. And the playwright, being very crafty, said, of course, you remember when you went to President Nixon, you had to ask him exactly the same thing. And President Nixon, of course, agreed. He gave you permission to totally edit and control the footage that was created. And so in this same way, I'm asking you to trust me based on what I did with the Queen, based on what I did with the whole series of very successful television and film works. And David Frost had a lot of advice saying, no, don't do it. He could turn you into a monster. He could do all kinds of things in the backstage story that he plans on telling. But David Frost agreed to do it. And it's very interesting, in a wonderful book that David Frost has written called Frost-Nixon, the book, he talks about the whole making of the interview and all the research that went into it. It's a much more scholarly treatment than you see in the play tonight. But he also has a chapter where he talks about what he went through in finally deciding to give the playwright permission to literally take his life and his greatest achievement and to treat it in a new way. Well, what's happened, of course, is the show, when it first opened at the Donmar Warehouse, was an enormous success. It sold out immediately. They had the very clever idea of hiring an American actor, of course, to play the American president, and Frank Langella was willing to work really at minimum to work at the Donmar Warehouse. But again, many world-class actors like Nicole Kidman and large numbers of major stars have been very happy to accept minimum salaries to work at the Donmar Warehouse because it is such a prestigious art house. So Frank Langella went and performed the show there. It's very interesting. In its first debut in London, the English were more interested in how David Frost was treated than they were in how the American president was treated. And again, what it had was this tremendous intimacy because it was in such a tiny space. When it moved to the West End, it was put into the Wyndham Theatre, which is a large theatre in London. And everyone was very nervous about how this very intimate little show would play in a very large space. Well, what happened was the show exploded, and the show was even more powerful in the Wyndham space than it was in the Donmar Warehouse. And to talk about that, let me just for a moment go back now to the director. Michael Grandage is a director of the highest order. He's trained in the English system. He understands the classics. He's devoted his career to doing new plays and musicals, but blending it with the great plays of the past. So he brings to everything he does a kind of classical taste. And so as a result of that, he's a wonderful showman. He knows how to tell a story wonderfully. Watch very carefully as you watch this show tonight. It's very simply done. Basically, a bare stage, a few pieces of furniture. But what becomes so compelling is a large screen that exists up center. It's placed very high, and your eye is pulled to it. At the beginning, you see little montages, little clips of Los Angeles, clips of London. But when they finally get into the filming, when they're actually taping, you literally see the taped event as it's happening live on the stage, but you also see it on the screen. The choice is to see long shots, so you see the figures in full body. But as we get deeper and deeper and deeper into the debate, you move into medium shots, close-up shots, and finally head shots that will become so indelible that you won't be able to forget them. And so what happened when this show moved from the Donmar Warehouse, where the major appeal was this tremendous intimacy sitting right on top, you felt like you were in the studio watching the debates being filmed. When they moved it to the Wyndham, what happened is it took on a bigger sort of Brechtian quality. And Bertolt Brecht, of course, in the theater used film clips. He would do things to break your attention so you didn't know if you should be watching the film clip or the action on the stage. Sometimes they were in juxtaposition. So all of these Brechtian ideas that were so brilliantly inserted into the play at the Donmar were fully realized in this big production at the Wyndham Theatre. And what happened as you sat, just as you will tonight, you're so riveted by what's happening on the stage, you start going into a conflict of should you watch Stacy Keach as he's talking to Alan Cox, or should you look up on the screen and watch the image on the screen? And you keep going through this debate. Watch what happens to you as you watch the show. You're so pulled in to the television video of it that your eye keeps going up. And finally, as the camera becomes more microscopic, and as we move deeper and deeper and deeper into the characters, we start really seeing the inner conflicts. There is a brilliant final moment when the image of Nixon freezes in that close-up. And it's a moment you never forget. And it reminds you of all of those indelible moments we've had with television. The Kennedy assassination, the Bobby Kennedy assassination, the Martin Luther King assassination, the World Trade Center. Those images are etched in our minds, but the images are the images that television gave us, those close-up snapshots that television provided. And what you have here then is this brilliant bit of stagecraft where the stage director realized that there was going to be great power in showing you the live event and showing you the event on television simultaneously. I mean, maybe when you go to a football game, you can look at the screen and see the event as it's playing on the screen, and you can literally watch the football game, and you get that sense of different energy that you have. But the same thing is true on stage. And it was a brilliant bit of stagecraft, and it's what made this intimate little show be able to explode on an enormous stage and be even more provocative. So what happened to the show then, it was a great hit in London. By this point, then, there was a lot more attention on the Nixon character because, keep in mind, London was going through its own upheaval with Tony Brown and the whole involvement with yet another war and all kinds of political scandals going on. And so suddenly, the American scandal took on a very strong resonance in England. And so the role of Nixon came into much more focus in the main version of it at Wyndham's Theatre in London. Of course, then moved to New York. Frank Langella was lauded by every critic for giving a defining and brilliant performance, and the New York cast then subsequently has made a film, which I really strongly recommend that you see if you haven't already seen it, because it works brilliantly in its filmic form, also directed by Michael Grandage. But then, I have to say, the production we're presenting stands right up to the best work of Frank Langella and the film and original stage version, in that Stacy Keach brings such power and towering presence to, and such believability to what he does that you're no longer looking for a caricature of President Nixon. You really feel that you have the essence of this character. One scene I would really like to point out for you. I don't want to spoil the telling of the story for you because the playwright is a master storyteller. He communicates with you in so many different ways. He uses the real text of the interviews. He then has very presentational scenes where characters speak directly to you from the stage, as I'm speaking to you now, in a very presentational, direct way. Then there are very intimate, private scenes that happen between two characters at one time. So we have this whole range of different kinds of theater and different kinds of storytelling happening simultaneously. And even all of this is told in a very stripped down way. There's very little scenery, a few chairs, a few images, but it becomes so etched in our minds, it becomes so real that less becomes more in this really triumphant production of stagecraft. But one scene I would really like to point out to you, deep in the show, and again, let me remind you, this is a work that's done without an intermission. It's an hour and 49 minutes long. It passes so quickly, you'll be riveted at every moment. Isn't it ironic that you can watch a piece where you know the ending, you know what happens, and yet you white knuckle it through the last 30 minutes of the show. It's so riveting and so compelling, and it pulls you in the brilliance of the storytelling. So watch for that, how the story is told. But look at this particular scene. It's a telephone scene deep in the show. Now, it's a scene that happens between the president and David Frost. It never really happened, and the playwright invented this scene. But what he has done is to give the show its greatest sense of clarity in that moment. And in the same way that Shakespeare would give brilliant soliloquies to Lear or Macbeth so we could move into their minds and literally into their souls, in the same way, through this telephone conversation that he invents so brilliantly, it gives us the opportunity of moving very deeply into both men. And I guess what I finally have to say about this is the playwright has treated both the president and David Frost in a very fair way. And in a way, he's framed the debate even better than David Frost did when they presented it as a television event. And of course, so much time has happened. So many political shenanigans have happened since then. We've had more wars to deal with, more hypocrisies to deal with, more lies to deal with. And the end result is, as we look at this piece, as it takes on a certain kind of distance, we see how pertinent and provocative it is even today. So remember, when you watch the show, the actors are triumphant. The staging is beautiful and the direction is superb and flawless, but it's really the playwright and his profound craft of being able to tell a story in a very interesting way. Watch how he's able to tell you things so simply. A simple gesture, a simple action, a simple handshake, a simple phone call will keep changing the dimension of the work. It's a very prismatic work. You look very deeply into it. It defines the time. It defines politics. It makes us even look into ourselves It's a very provocative work, and I'm very happy that it's at Playhouse Square, and I'm delighted that this is an experience you're going to be having in a few minutes. Just in summary again, I'm sorry I'm not with you. I'll be back for the next show and so look forward to it. I want to remind you that the stage manager has a special gift for one person. So if you don't mind looking at the back of your program, I've signed a little message to one person, and you've won a gift certificate to have a drink. So it is my hope someday that you'll all be having drinks at Broadway Buzz. But until then, enjoy Frost Nixon. Thank you.